Bill, can you hear me?
I sure can. How you doing, Sean?
Hey, good man. It's good to see you again. Thanks for taking the time out to do this. Hope things are going well for you. I know you got a book coming out, so we want to talk about that. But before we do that, for the folks that aren't maybe familiar with you, could you just give us a little background, Bill?
Absolutely. So my background, my academic training is in archaeology and anthropology. So I've been an archaeologist, anthropologist, professor for almost 25 years. And more recently, have been trained professionally as a chef. I left Washington College, where I've been teaching for the past 14 years, and my wife and I have started a company called the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, which is where we take ancestral approaches to food and transform them and actually produce the food themselves to feed the community. We have a whole host of classes and workshops, and I continue to do research, which includes not only archaeological research around the world, but ethnographic research with living indigenous and traditional groups, understand how they cook, how they eat, and how they transform raw materials into their safest and most nourishing forms possible.
Very good. So now, are you still on I remember last time I thought you were somewhere like maybe Virginia or somewhere, Maryland or something like that. Where are you at these days?
Yeah, same place. We're on the eastern shore of Maryland in a beautiful little town called Chestertown, right on the close to the banks of the Chesapeake Bay.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. Well, let me just, preparing food, in a way that is, you're limited to because where you're at and what your environment is.
Sure.
How, like, for instance, I'm here, I got a Traeger grill, I got a 1500-degree Auto-Wild grill to cook stuff. I mean, can I adapt some of that stuff? Can I use those tools that I have to prepare food that would meet your sort of standards, or do you have to have an open fire? How does it work? Just give us some examples.
That's a great question. Well, first off, I just literally ordered my first Traeger grill, and it is waiting for me to pick up today. So I'm super excited to see how it works. And we sprung for the big one, the 1300. Yeah, it's important to understand ancestral diets, as you know, to get that baseline, understanding that diet that built us as humans and the way that our food, how we selected our food and how we prepared our food, I think is essential to understanding how we can feed our modern bodies, which are essentially not modern. They're 300,000 years old, right? So we're living in Stone Age bodies, but trying to eat this weird, modern, crazy diet. And it just doesn't work. So understanding the technologies, which is where my focus is, that prepared food properly and got it ready for our bodies is essential. And heat cooking is one of them. 3.5 million years ago, we started eating meat, and that was pre-fire, pre-hunting. We were scavenging from other animals on the African savanna. And to be completely honest, when we just started eating meat and raw meat, not a whole lot changed biologically for us. Our bodies didn't jump in size. Our brains didn't jump in size, at least to any great degree. When that happened, our biggest jump in body and brain size happened 1.5 million years later, 2 million years ago, when Homo erectus first appeared. And the two essential technologies that were developed at that time was fire technology, or control of fire, so for things like cooking, and also hunting technology, which allowed us to take down animals at will, at our own will. We didn't have to wait for something else to take that animal down. And most importantly, in my mind, is that we had full access to the entirety of that animal, not just the scraps that were left behind. So in addition to lean flesh, we had access to the blood, the fat, and the organs, and we could cook these foods. So to more directly answer your question, every one of us has, I don't care where we live, whether it's in a flat in a little tiny apartment or something in New York City, or a mansion out west somewhere, all of us have kitchens that are better equipped now than any of the kitchens our ancestors had, where they were dealing with open fires, clay pots, caves, sticks, those sorts of things, stone tools. And it isn't necessarily the fact that it's an open fire that makes a difference, but using that heat properly is what makes the difference. So in particular with meat, the cool thing about animals in our diets is that when we look at the technologies our ancestors developed to access food and make food safe and as nourishing and bioavailable as possible, when it comes to plants, almost all that technology up until the agricultural revolution was focused on how to take these plants. Every plant on this earth has some level of toxin in it, and how to take those plants and make them safe for us to eat, and just as importantly, even though plants do have nutrition in them, a lot of that nutrition is locked up and difficult for our human bodies to access. So all these technologies, all this time was spent with plants trying to figure out how to make them safe and get the nutrients out of that plant into our bodies. But animals are different. Almost all the technology surrounding animals was how to actually hunt them and kill them. Once you have a dead animal in front of you, all you need is a sharp edge, and almost the entirety of all of that nutrition sitting in front of you is ready available to our bodies, especially with the blood, the fat, and the organs. As far as meat is concerned, it turns out, and a lot of work has been done here, only a tiny bit of processing with red meat makes the nutrients in it a little bit more easy for our human bodies to access. So number one, some sort of cutting, chopping, grinding, slicing helps with raw red meat a little bit. It's not huge. I mean, eating a steak and eating ground up meat is very similar in what our bodies can do with it, but it's just a little bit easier when that meat is either sliced or ground up. And second, a little bit of cooking turns out does make some of the nutrients in that meat a little more available to our bodies without our bodies having to work so hard. So a raw big hunk of red meat is great. Taking that raw hunk of red meat and either slicing it or grinding it makes it easier for our bodies to access. And then if we do a little bit of cooking, it makes it even easier. So in my mind, the most bioavailable form of eating red meat is like a medium rare hamburger. But again, it's not huge. In plants, it makes a big difference, the processing. With meat, a little bit of mechanical processing and a little bit of heat does make a little bit of difference.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought that up, Bill, because there's a lot of people that under the impression that, you know, if you don't eat meat raw, you're losing out on all this nutrition. And I mean, that's really not what the science says, or at least what I've been exposed to. And, you know, I think it's something that, you know, I mean, and your point, I mean, it seems to be debatable when we first access fire, particularly for cooking. And I know you put it back, you know, back into Homo erectus, which is quite a few years ago, and other people say no, it's more recent. And what does the preponderance of the evidence suggest, and where do you know, how do you know that? I know we talked about being able to migrate from Africa into the cold parts of, you know, Southern Europe and Asia to be able to survive that, having access to fire. So what's the basis evidence that says we were cooking back a million plus years ago?
So that's a really, really, really good question. I and several other people like Richard Wrangham, and if anybody is really interested in the fire conversation, I wholeheartedly recommend reading two books, one by Richard Wrangham, who's a primatologist from Harvard, and the other is by a woman named Frances Burton. And all of us agree, or at least suggest, that the domestication of fire started at about 2 million years ago. And I'll explain why in just a minute. But if we're looking for direct evidence, where we can actually look in the archaeological record and see that somebody had fire, controlled fire, you know, put that fire out, the evidence is really, direct evidence is really closer to about 1 million years. And that's even fairly scarce. And then, you know, you start seeing a lot more evidence, direct evidence at about 500,000 years ago. So why would anybody even suggest 2 million years ago? Well, let me tell you what it looks like archaeologically. Imagine if, you know, you went out and were camping and had a fire for that night, put that fire out, you know, just a small fire, not a bonfire and a big party, college party, but a regular fire to cook on, maybe give you a little bit of light, maybe a little bit of warmth. Put that fire out and walked away and left it on the ground. You can imagine you'd have difficulty finding that fire a year later, and really have a lot of difficulty 2 million years later. So it's really difficult to see these things. When we find it, there's a lot of people that, like me, would look at it and say, well, if we found it now, there's really probably a good chance that there's something a little bit earlier, and either we haven't found it yet, or we don't have the right tools yet in our archaeological toolkit to identify what they are, and maybe in a few years we'll find it. And that's one of the reasons why we keep pushing these dates further and further back, because our ability to identify and interpret the archaeological record is getting better with new advances in archaeology. Second, Frances Burton does a great job of arguing and making this point. Humans are one of the only animals that not only have an association with fire, but aren't deathly afraid of fire. So it isn't an overnight phenomenon that all of a sudden, hey, we invented fire, and then now we know how to deal with it. We're not afraid of it. And we're going to use it to our advantage. In fact, she suggests that our relationship with fire started at least 1 million years earlier in order to get to the point where we saw the benefits of it, started to understand that we could control it, fuel it, put it out, those sorts of things, to even get to the point where 2 million years ago, we would have controlled it. And then there is some, depending on your interpretation, there is some direct evidence that has been interpreted at 2 million years, but it's a little bit scarce and it's a little bit controversial. But like you just mentioned, Sean, one of the other things that's incredibly important is the understanding that at 2 million years ago, not only do we have this appearance of our largest, at the time, our largest bodied and brained ancestor, Homo erectus, but Homo erectus is the first of our ancestors to leave Africa and start to move into northern latitudes, into places like Europe and parts of Asia. And when they do that, they're doing that at the beginning of the last ice age. So here we have there's no evidence for clothing until about 200,000 years ago. So here we have our naked ancestors in equatorial Africa leaving and moving north at the beginning of the last ice age into northern climates where it's incredibly cold. And in order to do that properly, you must have some sort of way to control your microclimate. And the best way to do that is through fire. So I know it's all a little bit sparse. I love that we're at least having that conversation, but I do believe that cooking was something we were doing at 2 million years ago.
Do we have any idea what the temperatures were, 2 million years ago, and in Europe and Asia where Homo erectus is found? I mean, I'm sure climate records can show you kind of estimate what the highs and low temperatures might have been. Any idea what that is? Were they dealing?
I don't know exactly what they are, but we do know that for sure. In fact, we have such good environmental reconstruction that we could tell you what the average temperature was in a month, to the month at a long time ago. So it is interesting, because to even have a conversation like this and to do it in this short period of time, you have to make a lot of generalizations. So, we're talking about 2 million years ago, and then thousands and thousands and thousands of years after that, we're lumping it together into one conversation, and also all different parts of the world. So we have some Homo erectus that stay in Africa, some move to Northern Africa, some go to Asia, some end up in Europe, some hit it at the, when the ice age. It isn't that there's like warm and then there's an ice age. During the ice age, from about 1.8 million years ago to about 15 or 12,000 years ago, we consider that the last ice age. But during that period of time, there were a whole bunch of changes where it got incredibly cold, what we consider an ice age, and then we have this interglacial period where it got almost as warm as today, and then it became an ice age again. So there's huge fluctuations. So I don't want to overlook all that different diversity, but I can tell you that Homo erectus was the most successful of our ancestors. Were on this planet for almost 2 million years. Not only did they, when they first appeared, did they appear with, at the time, massively large brains and bodies, but their brains actually grew during the period of time that they were on this planet. So you have early Homo erectus with a big brain size, and over the 2 million years, almost 2 million years that they were on this planet, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. So whatever they were doing really, really well.
Yeah, I'm just currently reading a book called Megafauna by a guy named Baz Edmeans. I'm not if you're familiar with him, but it's called the Megafauna: The First Victims of Human-Caused Extinction, and it talks about just the variety of animals. I mean, it must have been incredible to see all these giant beasts that were around at the time that humans were actually engaged with, and it looked at. Surprisingly, I didn't, according to them, we went after a lot of these big tortoises that were around. There were these giant tortoises everywhere, and they were particularly fatty. And you mentioned, going from scavenged animals, because when you follow African lions on the plains, they'll leave zebra carcass and they'll leave the hindquarters, which we know is all that lean, that shank meat, which is not particularly rich in fat. And so once you have access to that, you mentioned fat and organs, brain, internal viscera is very fatty, and it is. Do you believe that the combination of fire and then that fat was what's allowed the humans to, Homo erectus, to evolve that brain? How much brain did they put on? I've seen from like 800 to 1100 cc's. Do you know how much brain size Homo erectus was able to increase over their tenure?
From the time they were on the planet until the time they were gone. Right. I don't know the numbers exactly in front of me. I'm sorry, but it was mathematically significant. And to follow up on that very quickly. When you look at, if I had a chart in front of me of our major ancestors over the past several million years and their brain size and the time they were on this planet, you would look at different Australopithecines, you look at Homo habilis, you look at Homo erectus, all the way up to modern day Homo sapiens. And every one of them, except for modern day Homo sapiens, you would see them appear with it. They first appear on Earth at a certain brain size. And as they're on the Earth, just like with Homo erectus, their brain size would increase. And then you'd see another species, same thing, except for Homo sapiens. When Homo sapiens first appear, we appear with good sized brains, and it looks like it plateaus. In fact, to be completely honest, and it's not that mathematically significant, but our brains today are slightly smaller than they were when we first appeared 300,000 years ago. And I don't want to suggest that food and nutrition is what fueled our body and brain growth. It's not. In fact, we're not really sure what was the trigger and what sparked it. But our access to food and nutrition is what supported that body and brain growth. So something else was going on, and there's a lot of different suggestions about what that actually was. But there's no doubt that our ancestors were getting increasingly good at finding ways of extracting more and more diverse and nutrient-dense resources from their environment, and most importantly, finding ways to take those raw materials and make them as bioavailable as possible before they even put them in their mouths. And the cool thing with animal resources is you don't have to do a lot to them in order to get that nutrition in the right state for our bodies. Some of it, in case of things like organ meats, is already ready to go in most cases.
Yeah. So, as you know, Aiello Wheeler's expensive tissue hypothesis in 1980s or whenever that came out, that was, our gut shrunk so our brain could grow. And that had to do with high quality access to better fuel, I suppose. Is that no longer in favor, or are you just saying that there's some other things that potentially? I just saw a recent article come out saying that humans' ability to access energy, and it didn't specify whether it was plant food energy or animal, and I suspect it's both, because as you're going to, I'm sure, teach us, there's a lot of processing that allows us to access the energy from certain plants, and some of them, you mentioned the toxicity. Some of these plants are flat out deadly if we don't process them correctly.
Sure.
So obviously, the complexity of life. I know I've talked to Mickey Bendor when he was looking at Homo sapien development in the Levant, and he talked about, some of the species extinctions that are going on as these elephants and mastodons are starting to perish. It's putting more pressure on humans to think in a different way in order to access food, and some of the hunting strategies. Is that something that aligns with what you've looked into?
Oh, 100%. And let me just real quick talk about the expensive tissue hypothesis. I don't like, it's certainly, if you went into almost any anthropology classroom, college classroom around the country, it would be taught the way that, it's been presented. But there are some people, including me, that think about it in a slightly different way. It isn't that, it's almost like that expensive tissue hypothesis requires us to not give any consideration to the changes that we have in technology to make food as nourishing as possible. It's like almost food is a constant, and in order for our brains to grow, our guts have to get smaller. And I don't like to think about it that way, because I don't think that's an accurate representation of what was going on. The reality is, and the way I like to think about it, is we were just getting increasingly good at accessing the most nutritious food possible from our environment. And that really, in almost all cases, means some sort of animal resource, and doing the processing that would be happening inside of our body, outside of our body, before we even eat it. So our bodies have to work less hard in order to get a massive amount of nutrients. And that's a win-win all the way around. So it isn't that our guts shrank because our brains got bigger. It's our guts didn't need to get any bigger. We were just doing a great job. And it is expensive to have a large gut. We just didn't need it because we were doing such a great job. And yes, I love Mickey Bendor's work. He's doing great stuff. And I know a lot of it's controversial, and it should be. One thing we should remember about anthropology and archaeology is that it is not a hard science. Right? It's not like chemistry. It's not like biology. It's not like physics. Sure, there's a lot of math and standards in archaeology when we lay out a grid on the ground and we understand the soil science and dig through different levels and be really accurate in the measurements and all that. But as soon as we find an artifact or a feature in the ground and pull it out of the ground everything else is based on interpretation, right? And we try to pull out and take away from it any sort of bias that we may have, but we're humans. We can't do that 100%. So as soon as something comes out of the ground, there's a whole bunch of interpretations happening. A lot of those interpretations are a product of the time in which the archaeology is being done. So us looking at a site today and interpreting it is a lot different than it was in the 1970s, and the 1960s, and the 1950s, when there was a huge focus in many ways on plants, and and we can go into the politics of it certainly, but the nice thing now is there are people like Miki Ben-Dor that are going back and looking at these sites that have been interpreted for a very long time through a new lens and a new set of eyes, and realizing that, hey, there's more than one interpretation that could be happening here. So directly to your point, yes, one of the things, I can imagine, and I don't want to paint this like paleo fantasy, but I can imagine that hunting 2 million years ago was really, really amazing. I mean, these huge animals, some of them not that fast, some of them, most of them not adapted to human predation, so it was much easier to get closer to them. But we see even at 500,000 years ago in Israel, these elephants becoming extinct through overhunting. And these larger animals are starting to become extinct or more scarce, and then that's where human innovation and ingenuity has to come in. And when we think about how we've captured animals in the past for food, I know we love to think about hunting and spears and atlatls and all these sorts of things, which is definitely what was going on, but we can't overlook things like trapping. Our ancestors were incredibly good at trapping, and the cool thing about trapping is that trap is doing the work while we're doing something else, right? You go, you set the trap, you walk away, and you go back and set the trap. And this becomes important when a lot of these larger animals were becoming more difficult to hunt. We start to see the faunal record change to smaller animals. And we do think a lot of that is a lot of those animals are being caught in traps.
Yeah, no doubt we had to make a shift at some point. Now let's talk a little bit about, and I want to get back to the food stuff, but somebody asked a question. You've spent a lot of time with a lot of these indigenous tribes, and this is just kind of an off topic, but there's a lot of people that like to run around barefoot. And they think there's an advantage to that. Why do most people run around barefoot? Are there shoes a net positive and net negative? What are your thoughts on that from your observations, I suppose?
That's a great question. I haven't. And I've gone to great lengths to spend time with as untouched groups of people as possible in South America and Asia and Africa. And unfortunately, just about every group on the world has been impacted at some level by modern life, whether that means T-shirts and shoes have made it in, whether that means some sort of Fanta or unfortunately, Snicker bars, no matter what. I will say this as a quick side note. People talk about Coca-Cola taking over the world. It's been very difficult for me, and I don't eat Snickers bars, but I'll tell you, Snickers bars are literally all over the world, have made it into places that Coca-Cola hasn't even made it into, and it's very upsetting. But I say that because there are groups in Africa that I spend time with that are still 100% barefoot. And as you know, and everybody else knows, there's a lot of benefits to being barefoot, not only that grounding sort of connection with the earth, but also the way that our feet develop over our lives and the constriction that shoes have on it. The groups that I've spent time with where it's incredibly cold, like in the high altitude in the Andes in Bolivia and Peru, and in places like Mongolia, they're wearing some sort of footwear, not necessarily because anybody's telling them to, just because it's so incredibly cold. But I will say, in most cases, people are wearing as little clothes as possible, and that isn't just shoes; it's also above their feet.
Yeah, so they're probably getting quite a bit of sun exposure, I suppose, in many places. Sure. Obviously, in the Arctic, it may not be conducive to that. Let me ask you about, and obviously this is a community of people that eat mostly meat or all meat or something like that, so they may not be as much interest. But I think it's interesting to talk about regardless. So, I mean, obviously humans depending upon where they were, what they had access to, would eat a certain amount of plants. Again, it would, and depending on the time of the year and so on and so forth. A lot of our foods are processed in a way to make them shelf stable. I mean, even, flour, you don't want a bunch of weevils in there. You don't want them to go bad on the shelves in 3 months. How did these sort of ancient man deal with that? And once they started securing food, how do they protect it so it could be, so it was edible? Or did they just eat everything and process it, at the moment? How did that work?
Well, it as you can imagine, it's hard to find direct answers to that question in the archaeological record, especially further back you go. But what we are finding is, and I can say this through archaeological evidence and ethnographic evidence, I have never found a culture, either through research, in books and or either direct anthropological research I've never found a group anywhere in the world where fermentation is not at the core of their dietary habits. Fermenting everything from vegetables to meat to literally whatever they have access to. So fermentation, we think about fermentation today in terms of obviously beer and alcohol and the like, and we think about it in ways of maybe increasing flavor or making a really cool texture that we like, or even adding probiotics and wonderful enzymes and vitamins in our food. But we can't forget that fermentation probably first started as a storage tool, and that's incredibly important to think about. And here is a food storage mechanism that doesn't deplete the nutrition over time. It actually increases the nutrition and the nutritional value and the bioavailability of the nutrients in that food, especially when we're talking about plants. So we do see fermentation very, very early on. And there's some early evidence that came out only a few months ago, and I'm trying to remember when, but I think it's 200,000 years ago, where we have meat that's getting packed in ashes and I think that was a preservative mechanism. But it depends on a lot of different factors. Fermentation is very important for plants in acidic fermentation. We're using lactobacillus bacteria. Fermentation is very important like that for dairy as well. But then when you start moving towards animals, you can either ferment in an acidic environment or in a basic environment. And actually, especially in Africa and in warmer climates, we see a basic fermentation where the pH is rising in order to preserve meat and bones and marrow and the like in places in Africa and Indonesia, and lots of places like that. So I don't have a direct answer to when those things started and how prevalent they were, but we're confident people were doing it. I can imagine a world in which most animal resources were consumed when the animal was killed. And usually, and we see this ethnographically, and the most perishable parts of an animal are the organs and the blood. So that's usually consumed first. And we see that still today. And then the meat certainly can be preserved through drying or through different types of fermentation. But what I've witnessed firsthand is typically these animals are killed. They start on one end, eat through the other end, and then they go off and try to kill another animal.
Yeah, that's, I'm just wondering about, like, if I kill an elephant, and I guess it depends how many people in our clan, I guess. And my understanding is humans existed in clans of 12 to 20 people typically. Is that realistic? Or before they developed civilizations, what was a living situation for early humans?
Yeah, now that is a number that we have come to. Yeah, that's accurate, and we think that number for two reasons. One is there are, again, it's very difficult to excavate a site and interpret at that one moment how many people were living there. Sometimes it's possible, depending on how the site was preserved. But when we've been able to do that, that is a fairly typical number. But just as importantly, when we look at the social dynamics involved with groups, when you get up to that 20 something, there's a threshold up there where when you surpass that, it's hard to keep one group together, and you end up splintering into smaller groups and smaller factions. So that number is a combination of some archaeological evidence, some ethnographic evidence, some anthropological evidence, and a whole bunch of interpretation. But we think that is about the size that's there. So you're right. If you kill a large animal and you have 15 people there, what do you do with it? And I will tell you that, and I know it's strange for us to think about it, but if you think about a human as a predator, just like any other predator on the African savanna, I don't think there's a whole lot of differences there. And we see this sometimes ethographically as well. So when you have a lion, or if it's 2 million years ago, an ancestor to a lion, which was even nastier, come out and kill something like a large, ancestor to a zebra or another large animal like that, they will rip it apart, eat the blood, the fat, and the organs, gorge themselves, go off and sleep, sometimes never even come back to that carcass, but sometimes they will, and they'll eat a little bit more. But quite often, some of that food is left behind. We can't, I know we love to paint this picture of our ancestors where they were at one with the earth and they were completely sustainable in everything they were doing. That's not true. They were often, they're certainly more connected to the earth than we are today. And they certainly, for a number of different reasons, were a lot more sustainable and ethical with the way that they approach food than we are today. But we also see a whole lot of waste. So we have, and I'm trying to pay attention to some of the conversations in the chat as we're talking. And somebody talked about, running these animals over a cliff. We see that, even here in North America, these buffalo jumps where they're running massive quantities of buffalo over the edge of these cliffs. And we see it all over the world with different animals. And they only have time to, before that meat goes bad, to get to a few of these animals, and the rest is left there to rot. So when we have a conversation like this, I don't want us to think that, okay, well, they've killed an elephant and they're going to eat that whole elephant and find ways to preserve it before it goes bad. In some cases that might be true, but in some cases they might leave it because part of it went bad and go hunt another elephant if it's easier to hunt that elephant than it is to preserve all that meat. I can't imagine what it's like to butcher an animal that large, but I can, just to put it in some sort of perspective, in 1973, I believe it was, my mentor, Dr. Eric Callahan, who's an amazing, he recently passed, but he was one of the best flint knappers, stone tool producers ever in the world, and a great experimental archaeologist. The elephant from the movie Hitari, the John Wayne movie Hitari, his name was Ginsberg. He was in the Boston Zoo and was sick, and they tranquilized him to move him somewhere to take care of him, and ended up they over tranquilized him. They killed him by mistake. So he heard this, and he was able to get that elephant transferred from Boston down to the Smithsonian Field Research Facility, which is outside of Front Royal, Virginia. They brought it down on a flatbed truck. And he, in connection with Dennis Stanford and other people at the Smithsonian, were going to run a whole bunch of experiments on this elephant to try to recreate some of the ways we think these animals were hunted and butchered in the past. So they replicated all the stone tools from about 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago here in North America, when you would have been hunting megafauna like woolly mammoths and mastodons, and atlatls and spears and all this. And the first thing they did was they wanted to test penetration of atlatls compared to spears. So this is a quick side note, but it's kind of funny. So I've seen the video from 1973. So Eric Callahan goes out, he spent months making all these tools, and he goes out and he throws this atlatl as hard as he can at this elephant, and it bounces off with a beautiful Clovis point on it. And you can see he's upset when they realized it was the middle of winter and this elephant was frozen solid. So they waited till it thawed, and then they went and did all these penetration tests on it. But more specifically to this conversation, then they were testing the efficiency of different types of stone tools and bone tools. Dennis Stanford had this theory that cortical bone fractures just like stone does. So you could essentially, if you took down a woolly mammoth and one of their bones broke, you could essentially use those bones to butcher the entire animal. So they were butchering this thing with bone, they were butchering with stone tools. And this is the Smithsonian research. They had, records, they had charts, and they were documenting everything, and every tool was labeled, and everybody was super careful. And it was such a massive undertaking to just butcher this one elephant, and it wasn't even that big of an elephant, that they actually lost tools that they've never recovered in the process, just with all the massive amounts of meat and fat and all those sorts of things. So again, I bring this up only to put it in context. Those of us who have butchered a pig or a hunt, maybe butchered a deer, it is nothing like the undertaking that there is with something like an elephant. And again, even the Smithsonian is losing tools in the process with trained researchers trying to do these sorts of things. So I can imagine in the past when an elephant was taken down and it was very difficult to take down something like an elephant, and there's maybe very scarce, I'm sure they did everything they could to use every single part of that animal. But when you're talking about certain periods of time where there are massive quantities of animals, they're very easy to take down because, again, they're not used to human predation and all that. I bet you there was a lot of waste as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the difference between subsistence and surplus situations, and you see that in animals too. I mean, if there's a lot of prey around, they're just they'll eat, like you said, they'll eat and they'll leave a lot of stuff. But if it's scarce, then they'll tend to do more, which makes sense. There's just a question there about our mammoths ruminants. No, I don't. I think elephants and mammoths are hindgut fermenters, so they're not ruminant animals. Just to clarify that question there. Let's talk about. I know. Well, one of the things, dairy has been obviously. I don't know. I mean, I don't think we were milking wild oryx. It's not till the domestication of these animals that we had really significant access to milk, and so a lot of people are down on dairy for various reasons. Now, you talked about if it's fermented, it seems to help quite a bit. Can you kind of touch on that again, Bill, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the earliest example of humans doing anything with dairy from another animal dates back a very long period. I write about it in the book, but there are cave paintings where the basis, the pigment was suspended in bovine. They don't know exactly which bovine, but in bovine milk. That doesn't mean they were milking it, certainly, and we see this around the world as well. When you kill a lactating animal, and one of the things that you eat are the mammary glands, and you can get milk that way as well. I imagine that milk at that level has been in our diets for a very long period of time, but that's a very low level situation. I do believe that the only food, and this is going to sound very strange, but other wild animals eat diets that their digestive tract is evolved to eat, right? And it works very well. And almost all that processing happens inside of their bodies. Humans are different. Humans are omnivores, not by design. We're omnivores by technology, because we've created technologies to access different raw materials that we have absolutely no business eating, which includes, by the way, meat. Right? and animals, because we are not built to be these predatory hunters, but we developed technology that allowed us to overcome our limitations and access these foods. So that and processing things like cooking and fermentation, all of these things are technological ways of expanding our digestive tract to outside of our bodies. And now all of a sudden, here we are as humans, as omnivores, because we do all of these things before we put that food into our mouths. But if we think about the one food that humans are specifically designed through evolutionary processes to consume is dairy for a short period of time, and that's when we're infants. We are mammals. We are designed to consume dairy from our mothers when we're infants. But as soon as we start weaning ourselves off of our mother's milk, just like every other mammal, we suppress or lose the ability to produce the enzymes needed to deal with that dairy properly, right? So a lot of people would look at that and say, oh, well, if we're not designed to consume dairy as adults, then we shouldn't consume dairy. And I don't believe that, because we're not designed to consume almost all the foods that we eat. But the question isn't, should we consume it? The question is, in my mind, how should we consume it? So if we look at, real quick, and allow me to do this very quickly to kind of set the foundation. If we look at what happens when we're infant mammals, when we're infant human mammals, when we drink from our mother's milk, or our mothers, this is what happens. We drink from our mothers. The milk that comes out of our mothers is A, at room temperature, B, completely alive and already in the process of fermenting. And then it goes into our digestive tracts. We swallow it. And as soon as it goes into our digestive tracts, it gets hit with several enzymes that we're naturally producing. Number one, lactase, which is taking care of the sugars, lipase, which is helping digest the fats and break down the fats, and then a chymosin-like enzyme which coagulates the milk. And what happens is when it goes into our stomachs, if all we're doing is drinking a liquid, liquids pass through our digestive tracts way too quickly for us to break down properly and to extract the nutrition from it. So we need to slow it down. And when nature has figured out how to slow it down by coagulating the milk. So the chymosin enzyme, which in the cheese making world is known as rennet, coagulates that milk. It sits in our stomachs longer. It sits in our small intestines longer. It ferments. It naturally ferments because it's raw milk at the right temperature. And the temperature is key because the temperature that milk is and our bodies are operating under is the perfect temperature for the beneficial bacteria in the milk to do their job. And that's lactobacillus bacteria. So lacto because of the milk, that's fermenting that milk. Through that fermentation process, several things are happening. One is more of the lactose is getting digested, and because that's the food for the bacteria. It's breaking down. The casein is turning into something called paracasein, which is easier for our bodies to digest. And that milk is chemically and physically transforming into something else. And then it goes into our small intestines, and then we begin to break it down. Now, when we wean ourselves off of our mother's milk and we're starting to eat solid foods, mammals in general stop producing or slow down the production of those enzymes. And some people think that it's weird that some humans are lactose intolerant, but the reality is we all should be lactose intolerant as adults. We stop producing that enzyme lactase. What's weird is that 40% of modern humans continue to produce that enzyme lactase into adulthood. The weird thing is that some of us are lactose tolerant, and that's through a couple of different genetic mutations in Africa and in Europe, separate genetic events. So the question now is, should we be drinking milk as adults? Well, no, we in my mind, we shouldn't, especially the kind of milk that we have access to. Most of us have access to, pasteurized, homogenized milk where most of the fat's been taken out of it. That has absolutely no business going into our babies' bodies, and definitely not into adult human bodies. But if you're talking about high quality raw dairy that's been fermented and essentially put through the same process outside of our bodies that we as infant mammals were doing inside of our bodies, then I think I can make the argument to say that can be a part of a healthy human diet. And just as a quick aside, you take a gallon of milk and turn it into yogurt, and if you ferment it for 24 hours, all the lactose is gone. It's been eaten up by the lactobacillus bacteria. So whether you're lactose intolerant or not, it doesn't make a difference in that case. You take cream and do the same thing. We're talking about real creme fraiche, real crema that's been fermented. Not only has it been chemically and physically transformed, but there's no lactose in the final product. So, real traditional cheese making is the same thing. So to more directly answer your question, I don't think there's any reason why anybody on this planet should be drinking glasses of milk. If you are, it should be high quality raw dairy. And we don't see around the world, except for a couple of isolated cases, we don't see traditional people drinking glasses of milk or putting it on cereal in the morning. It's almost always fermented. And fermented dairy is a completely different food that has been in much of our human diet. I know it's not that long, but for at least 10,000 years. And I think there's some validity to say that it can be part of a healthy human diet today.
Yeah, interesting if you look at population studies, when we correlate growth and height, countries that consume a lot of dairy, Scandinavians and some other ones, Northern Europeans, where dairy is a big part of the diet, they tend to be taller than some of these places like that, where you get persistent lactose deficiency, say around the equator. And I don't know if that's just due to the latitude or if the dairy has an impact, but there's certainly that correlation there. So it's interesting to see. Let's talk about processing plants a little bit, because some of the thought is, with these modern foods, we have ultra processed stuff that we turn into literal powder, flours, sugars, and it changes the way food is absorbed compared to, because you talk about how we're designed versus what we eat. And so do you see any, when we look at this modern obesity epidemic, some people think it's the ultra processing of foods, and allows for greater access to energy because you've so increased the surface area and broken it down, it rather than having to do the work to digest it and lose some of that, and it becomes inefficient. How do we process plants to make them, one, to detoxify them? Because as you know, there are many even berries, I can't go out there and randomly eat berries off a tree. Many of them are poisonous to me, even though fruits are considered more, I guess, enticing. The plant wants you to eat them is the argument, but there's a lot of berries that will kill me. And we all know about poison berries and poison apples and stuff like that. So how do we deal with plants? What was the solution for plants once we started to have to eat them more? In my thought, again, Mickey Bendor makes this point that as we started to see the loss of these big megafaunal animals, we had to get creative, and we started to access more and more plant materials in addition to the leaner animals we are now hunting. Is that jibe with what you've absorbed? And then how do we deal with the plants?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And the plants themselves, remember, I mentioned this earlier, and all of us know this, but all plants have some level of toxin in them. Some are at a very low level, and it's a type of toxin that really are sort of benign, and they're not a big deal unless we overconsume them. Some of them will kill us outright, and many of them will build up in our bodies over time, like things like oxalates, for example, and cause damage later on in life. The reality is all plants have some level of toxin. Now, if you look at any hunter-gatherer group in the world, and you look at anybody who's a real forager, especially subsistence foraging, they recognize this, because it's very easy to see this in the wild plant world, right? Because those toxins are up front in your face, and you realize that most of these plants need some sort of detoxification in order to make them safe to eat. The problem is, and this is where I think there's a huge issue, we have, through selective breeding and farming practices, have reduced the toxins in a lot of these plants, right, to a level where they can sit in the grocery store now and we don't think about them, right? And that's very, very dangerous, because many of us will go in the grocery store and say, oh my God, not probably anybody in this group, but many people today, right, would go into the produce section and say, oh my gosh, I'm ready. It's my New Year's resolution. I'm going to get healthy. I'm in the produce section. This is where I need to be. Some of this is good, more of it's better, and turn their brains off and just start loading their grocery carts with all these foods. But what they don't realize is they are creating an incredibly dangerous situation, and especially some of these foods like potatoes, for example, or spinach, where you have high level of toxins that can cause all sorts of issues, especially if you overconsume them. So the detoxification strategies are dependent on several different things. One is the level or type of technology in that group. One is access to resources that they have, the type of toxin, and the type of the type of toxin and the quantity and amounts that you're eating. So here's a couple of very quick examples. Tannic acid is a great example. Tannic acid is water soluble. It is in all sorts of different foods. And one of the places where it appears, a staple prehistorically, but not so much today, is in acorns. And it's very easy to detoxify acorns in water because it's water soluble. Now you look at certain plants like manioc in South America, places like Brazil, which is, has cyanide. It's a staple around the Amazon, but it has cyanide producing compounds in it. It still kills people every single year, even though it's a staple crop and we know how to detoxify it, and requires massive processing, from harvesting and peeling and grading and fermenting and drying and then grinding into flour. And then, and only then, if you've done it right, is it safe to eat. And then you have plants like potatoes, where, potatoes were first domesticated around 10,000 years ago. And the wild ancestor potatoes are incredibly toxic, like will kill you toxic. And a lot of the early varieties of potatoes were just as toxic. We hear about Columbus coming to the New World, and at that time there were between 300 and 600 different types of potatoes under domestication. That's 100% true. But most of them were so toxic they would kill you without some sort of processing. Now, I spent time recently, 2 years ago, with native groups in Bolivia, up in the Lake Titicaca area. They were Aymara Indians, and then in Peru with Quechua Indians, to understand how they detoxified potatoes. That was the sole purpose of the trip. And it's very cool. In this one region, I was with this one particular group in Bolivia, because they are one of the few people left on Earth that still practice geophagy, or the intentional consumption of earth or clay with their food. And it's something that we see across animal species. A lot of animals, almost all animals, consume earth or clay, and they do it for one of two reasons. One is because there's minerals that you can get from the earth. And number two, and probably more importantly to this conversation, because certain types of clays are incredibly detoxifying, especially illite and montmorillite and several others. And here they were growing and harvesting one of the most toxic varieties of potatoes that are still under domestication. And the way that we ate it was after we built this little earthen oven and then, baked them and pulled them out. And we had 2 bowls of clay, and it was a particular types of clay, and they were mixed with a little bit of salt and water. So they had the consistency of like mayonnaise. And every single bite of that potato went into the clay, then into our mouths, into the clay and into our mouths. And that's how they consume these potatoes. And the toxins would bind with the clay, pass through their bodies, and they would reap the benefits of the food. And then the group in the Andes would actually ferment the potatoes for a minimum of 6 months to make something called tokash. And after that, and only then, were those potatoes safe to eat. So the different types of food processing for plants can run the gamut, again, depending on a lot of different factors. But I think the big takeaway message, 2 takeaway messages here. One is a lot of time and effort, and I think, again, because of scarcity or different reasons, were put into finding ways to make plants safe. And they understood that this was something that had to happen. If I'm going to eat a plant, the opening line of my chapter on plants in the book, the opening sentence is, plants should scare the hell out of you. And again, that doesn't mean that necessarily you shouldn't eat any plants. It means that we need to respect and understand that plants have these issues, and any nutrition they can provide comes at a cost. It's a cost benefit analysis. So that's number one. And number two, the second takeaway message here is, we should approach vegetables today with that same mindset. Okay, if I'm going to eat that vegetable, if I'm going to eat that plant, then I need to understand that there are potential issues here. I need to detoxify them. And then in most cases, I need to also do something to those plants to make the nutrients in that plant available to my body. And if you think all that work is still worth it, then go ahead and do it. But just don't do that. Turn off your minds in the grocery store and load your your cart with a whole bunch of plants and think you're doing your body some sort of favor.
Yeah, Bill, just, for instance, if I go to the store and whatever, there's a whole produce section, and, there's all kinds of foods I can buy, and then there's also the garbage just is in the middle of the store that probably no one has much business eating outside of an occasional dalliance. But, are there things in the store that, we have great modern processing machines. We have these giant, computer-driven processes for all this stuff. But are there things like that I should do let's say I want to eat something out of the produce aisle? Are there certain things I need to do to these things to make sure that I'm not harming myself or potentially exposing myself to toxicities?
Sure, absolutely. So number one, it's selection. So you would look for the plants that have the lowest toxic levels in them. And unfortunately, not a whole lot of work has been done here. But things in the cabbage family are usually very, very safe. Onions, garlic, those are amazing foods with amazing flavors and textures, and also nutrients that are very easy for us to access. Although I will say anything in the cabbage family always does better with fermentation, like sauerkraut, but those are fairly easy for us. When we start looking at other young shoots are usually pretty good too, things like asparagus and the like. But when you start looking at things like potatoes, for example, I know you mentioned berries earlier, but if you think about it, a very general way to think about this is, plants were not put on this planet to feed us. Plants are here and they're trying to do the same thing every other organism on this earth is trying to do: reproduce viable offspring so they don't go extinct. And plants fight this battle through chemical warfare because they can't move. Yeah, they'll have thorns and they can have bark on the trees for protection, but they are fighting a chemical warfare battle with the outside world because they cannot move. But if you look at those plants in a very general way and think about what they do and how they operate, it's for the most part very easy to understand in a general sense what's safer usually than not with plants and plant parts. So a plant does not want to be eaten, right? A plant, so you can find toxins in the shoots and in the leaves, but they're not necessarily, it's not that big of a deal if a plant loses a couple leaves. So usually they're not that toxic. But, when you think about a root, an underground storage organ, or an underground storage organ, we call them, like roots, corms, and tubers, these are energy powerhouses for the plants, especially these perennial plants where the top dies. Like a potato plant, for example, the top would above the ground would die off, and the sole survival mechanism of that plant is all the energy stored in that root until the spring comes in and it sends up a new shoot. So you can imagine the amount of effort that plant has in trying to keep that underground storage organ, that root, corm, or tuber, safe. Now, there's toxins loaded in a potato, but most of the toxins, and this goes against everything I learned as a kid, but most of the toxins in a potato and similar sorts of parts of a plant are actually in the skin. And it makes complete sense because that's the barrier. If these toxins that the plants are producing are there to protect that plant, that's the barrier between the fungus and the insects and the predation from the outside world and the inside, which is really, really important. So that skin, I will tell you, I spent a lot of time in Bolivia and Peru. I ate and saw eaten more potatoes than I will ever see. I lived in Ireland for a year, and nobody ate potatoes as much in Ireland as I saw. I'm talking people were eating 8, 12, sometimes 15 potatoes a day per person. Every single potato I saw prepared, except for in one instance. No matter where I was peeled, period, across the board. Every single potato. And this is really important to understand that, if I gave you a russet potato and gave you a potato peeler and said peel it, you could do it in about 30 seconds. These potatoes, these heirloom potatoes look like this. They had knobs and things, and they didn't look like a round, and nobody had a potato peeler. So the effort that it took to peel those potatoes and that it was done so often and all the time meant that it was incredibly important. Every potato was peeled. The only time it wasn't peeled was when we ate it with the clay, which suggests to me the power in that clay in detoxifying. So to answer your question again more directly, I always, if I'm eating any kind of root vegetable, I always take the skin off. I always peel it. That's number one. Fermentation, again, is key in a lot of cases to making things safe and making the nutrients more available to our bodies. But a very simple thing to do is to eat seasonally. Spinach. I have a huge issue with oxalates myself. I eat absolutely no spinach whatsoever. It's one of the highest oxalate containing foods in the grocery store. But I don't really have an issue with eating spinach, because even despite its high oxalate content, if you eat spinach when spinach would naturally grow in the area that you live, the problem isn't eating spinach. The problem is we've made spinach available 365 days a year. And we've touted it as a superfood. And that whole mentality, some is good and more is better. There are people that are eating spinach shipped from around the world and from the frozen food section literally every single day. And that's where a lot of the issues come. So many of these plants in the grocery store, if you ate, if all you did was eat them hyper seasonally, not because somebody has a hoop house or a greenhouse or something that's allowing those plants to grow when it wouldn't normally grow. But if you're eating just hyper seasonally with your vegetables, you'd solve 90% of the problems right there.
Let me ask you I know we're running out of time here, Bill, but I want to ask you about a couple people had questions about access to salt. And was salt important? Is it important in these sort of indigenous populations that you observed? How do they access it? Do they worry about it? How do we deal with salt?
Yeah, salt. I have never found a group that didn't have salt in their diet at some level, and they either had access to it directly or actually brought it in. I was with the Hadza about 6 years ago now, which is the oldest hunter-gatherer group in the world, and they only bring in 2 foods from the outside world. One is salt, and the other is maize, and that's more of a product of modern times. But salt was something that they would always bring in. Salt's incredibly important, and I don't know a group that doesn't have access to salt or found a way to have access to salt.
Bill, tell me, so first of all, I want you to describe tell us about your book, what it is, where they can get it, and then a little bit about your business, about where people might want to go if they're interested in learning some of these techniques and learning more what you do.
Sure. Thank you, Sean. So the book is titled Eat Like a Human, Nourishing Foods and Ancient Ways of Cooking to Revolutionize Your Health. And it is a product of literally a lifetime of research. And it is the first chapter lays the foundation. It has the most up-to-date information on our ancestral dietary past over the past 3.4 million years. And that sort of lays the foundation. And every chapter after that is divided by different food groups that I thought were relevant for the conversation. So we have plants, we have animals, we have maize, dairy, those sorts of things, insects. And what I tried to do in each chapter was make everything that we talked about today not only informative and relevant, but also with meaningful takeaway. It's great to have these conversations, but then it's, what do I do with this information? It's more than just a sort of intellectual conversation. The book is loaded. I have 75 recipes in there, tons of tips and tricks, ways of preparing food we have access to as modern humans, to take these lessons, this understanding of how we had the best practices for making the raw materials we have access to as safe, nutrient dense, and bioavailable as possible. And it does, it runs, the cool thing is no matter what your take on the ingredients in your diet is, whether you are a carnivore, whether you're focused on keto, whether you're Weston Price follower, whether you're a vegan, a vegetarian, no matter what you are, you can improve. Now, certainly we can have large discussions about whether or not we should be eating meat, right? But no matter what it is that you do, what you include in your diet, there are ways of taking those raw materials and making them more nourishing for your body. And that's really what this book is focused on. So it released in the US in November. So it's widely available. It's in all the Barnes & Noble bookstores. It's on Amazon. It's on all the online platforms as well. It's releasing in 2 weeks in a lot of other places in the world. And what I'm super excited about is we are just now launching. We'll have information up in the next, we have a little bit of information now, but it'll all be launching on February 1st. We're doing a 2-month intensive course where we dive deep into that book, and we literally go chapter by chapter. There's behind the scenes stories. There's a lot of different people that we meet around the world, and through that book, we'll have live interviews and conversations with them, and cooking classes for how to actually take those recipes and do demonstrations with that. So there's a ton of information on there. I tried to make it as relevant, meaningful, and accessible as possible. And everything in that book you can do in your home kitchen. Information on me you can find at eatlikeahuman.com, and the business that my wife and I have, the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, you can find at modernstoneagekitchen.com. And please come and visit us. If you're on the East Coast, we really made that book come alive here in Chestertown, Maryland, where we're producing all of those foods using the same approaches and techniques, and really incredibly high quality ingredients.
Well, thank you very much. I have one other, anytime we start talking about eating like our ancestors, eating a Paleolithic type diet, whatever, the retort is, yeah, but those guys only live to be 25 or 30 years of age. Can you shed some light on that statement, on how I think it's inaccurate? What are your thoughts on it?
It's entirely inaccurate. And the problem is people say that in the conversation, just gets shut down, and nobody, dives a little bit deeper into it. There's, first off, the average age is much higher than 25 years old. But the problem is the math, right? The average is meaningless, because look, humans, when we stood upright 5 million years ago, we gave up a lot, right? We gained a lot, but we gave up a lot. And one of the things that we sort of gave away was ease of childbirth, right? And unfortunately, as human women have the most dangerous and painful childbirth of any animal on the planet. And that's because when we stood up, we had to change everything about our pelvic region, and our pelvises were smaller. There's only a small space for our children to come out of. And through evolutionary processes, we really found that balance between being able to give birth to the biggest headed babies possible, and still try to keep everybody alive and safe. And what we've done is, in order to make that happen, we've maxed out the head, and the hole that the head comes through when a baby's born on a human, but we still have the largest brains, comparable to body size of any animal on the planet. And what we've done is we've increased the neoteny, the period of time where our massive brain growth and development happens outside of the body. I mean, if you look at a horse, a horse is born and you need to stand there for an hour to make sure that horse stands up within an hour. I mean, we humans give birth to the most helpless babies on the planet. And that's because, a lot of that growth, important growth, that head growth, that brain growth happens outside of the body. And through cultural practices, we're supposed to take care of those babies when they're so helpless for so very long. And that's part of the human experience. And because of that, a lot of babies, especially in the past, died at childbirth or at very young ages. And if you take that out of the equation for the average lifespan, and there's a lot of different numbers, but you can have estimations of an average lifespan of 65 to 80 years old when we do the math that way. And that's a pretty cool life. But I would also say the other part of the conversation that not enough people have is how long do they live? Well, really, we look at modern day humans, we're dying longer, we're not living longer. Wild animals, and this is across the board, wild animals live these incredible lives and then keel over dead, right? We somehow have normalized the idea that, we're on this earth, hopefully most of us live this great life, and then we die for 20 or 30 years, and we're in nursing homes and we're wheelchair bound and we're sick, and most of this because of things we're doing to ourselves. We really have to start framing this conversation about how long we are actually living and what that quality of life really is. And we're talking about our ancestors who are a lot closer to a wild animal than we are today. They were living incredible lives and keeling over dead, and that's exactly how I want to live.
Yeah, I like that. Don't die for a long time. Anyway, thanks so much, Bill. I appreciate it. Eat Like a Human is the book. And then there's, the subtitle, I can't remember, but anyway, I'm sure you can find it that way. And if you'd be so good, I know everybody enjoyed this. Maybe we can get you back in for some more discussion down the road if that's possible.
Absolutely. Hey, I love what you do. I love to be a part of your conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Bill. All right. Have a great one, guys. We'll see you guys back tomorrow. Take care, Bill. Bye-bye now.
Join Revero.health for a 30-day free trial to get access to live Q&A with VIP guests, social community meetings, member discounts, low-carb healthcare providers list, forum, workouts, monthly challenges, early access to podcasts, recipes, carnivore diet guide, fasting guide, shred guide, and much more.